I've always believed that beauty grows best in silence. While the world was still stretching into its day, I'd be by my bedroom window, knees pulled to my chest, a pencil in hand, and the soft scent of jasmine drifting in from the garden. That little sketchbook of mine, the one with the torn cover and coffee stains, held every version of the life I dreamed of. Bouquets bursting with soul, petals scribbled with hope, roots tangled in rebellion. I never wanted much. Just a tiny flower shop with sunlit shelves and people who understood that flowers can speak when words fail. But in my house, dreams like mine were weeds. My father, sharp, immovable, always in control, had his mind set long before I even knew what mine was made of. Medicine, prestige, legacy. I was supposed to honor the family, whatever that meant. My mother, always one step behind him, just nodded along, never meeting my eyes. They spoke of sacrifice like it was sacred, but only when it was mine. And I tried, I really did, to be their kind of good. I swallowed my colors and smiled through the ache of not choosing myself. The first time I said no, my voice barely made it past my lips. I remember my hands trembling under the dinner table, my nails digging into my palms just to keep me grounded. But when I said it again, louder, firmer, clearer, something inside me cracked open. I told them I wasn't going to apply to med school. I told them I didn't want to save lives in operating rooms. I wanted to bring beauty to the broken ones. My father laughed, this bitter, hollow sound. My mother whispered something about shame. And I just stood there, spine stiff, heart in flames, choosing myself for the first time. They didn't argue long. My father's voice turned cold, sharp like frostbite. He called me ungrateful, disgraceful, selfish. Said if I walked out that door, I'd stay out. My mother handed me my backpack like it was a favor. No money, no goodbye, just a house that had never really felt like home closing its doors for good. I left with shaking legs and nothing but a binder of floral sketches pressed tight against my chest. And as I stepped into the night, alone but strangely alive, I whispered to myself, if I can't grow under their roof, I'll grow somewhere else. And I'll bloom so loudly they'll hear it in their silence. The first night was the hardest. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because I felt numb, like someone had turned the volume down on the world. I sat on a bus bench, hugging my backpack like it could protect me from the weight of everything I'd just lost. The city lights blurred as I stared straight ahead, not sure where to go, only certain I couldn't go back. My phone buzzed once. It was a message from my dad. Don't come crawling back. I stared at it for a long time before deleting it. No reply. Some silences say more than any scream could. That night, I slept in the hallway of a friend's apartment building. Not inside, just tucked between the stairs and a stack of delivery boxes, my hoodie pulled over my face to keep out the cold. My binder was under my head like a pillow. I kept thinking, this is rock bottom, this is it. But even then, somewhere deep in my chest, a little voice whispered back, no, this is planting season. It sounds poetic now, but back then, it just felt like survival. One breath at a time, one ache at a time. Still, I held on to that binder like it was my compass, because if I could see the flowers, maybe I could still find the way. Over the next few days, I wandered. I asked around at every corner store and street stall that sold anything remotely green. Most people brushed me off. Too young, too inexperienced. One guy told me I had too soft a face for real work. But then, at this tiny stall wedged between a laundromat and a pawn shop, an older woman looked at me, really looked, and said, "Can you sweep petals without crushing them?" I nodded. That's how I got my first job. No paycheck, just a few coins and leftover croissants at closing time. But I showed up every morning before sunrise, hands raw, shoes soaked in dew, learning the names of flowers like they were old friends I'd forgotten. She never asked why I was there, never offered advice, but she taught me through silence how to cradle roses without bleeding, how to wrap a bouquet so it feels like a secret being passed from one soul to another. I started sketching again on breaks, adding color to old designs, letting the pain slip into the petals. I didn't know it then, but that's when it began. the slow, quiet rebuild. Not with money, not with comfort, but with grit. And the scent of jasmine that still somehow found me, even when everything else was gone. I started collecting moments the way other people collect coins or ticket stubs, tiny flashes of proof that I was still here, still growing. The first time a stranger complimented the way I arranged daisies next to lavender. The time a child pointed at one of my sketches and said, "That flower looks like it's dancing." These weren't milestones anyone else would notice, but to me, they felt like roots taking hold. Every compliment stitched something back together in me. Every small kindness was a seed. I was no longer just surviving. I was beginning to stretch toward the light. There were days I wanted to quit. Days when my fingers were so cracked, they stung just holding a ribbon. When my body ached from standing, and hunger pressed into my ribs like a second spine. But whenever I thought about giving up, I'd pull out that binder. Page after page of color and chaos and yearning. It reminded me why I chose this. Why I left behind everything safe. My parents thought they could starve the dream out of me. They didn't realize I'd already learned how to feed myself on nothing but hope. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch my reflection in a dark shop window, hair messy, cheeks hollow, eyes full of fire. I barely recognized her, this girl who dared to say no and meant it. But I liked her. She wasn't soft the way they said. She was steel wrapped in petals. Quiet, yes, but no longer afraid. And I'd tell myself, this isn't the end. This is just the soil. Because somewhere in the distance, far from their house, their rules, their silence, something was waiting to bloom. And whether they ever saw it or not didn't matter anymore. The stall smelled like damp cardboard and crushed stems, but to me, it was heaven. I was finally touching the dream. Not the glossy version I'd imagined as a girl, but the raw, messy, back-breaking kind. I swept, I pruned, I carried buckets twice my weight. I learned how thorns teach you to handle beauty with care. I still didn't have a bed of my own, just a space on the floor in a crowded apartment I shared with two girls I barely knew. But I didn't complain. My rent was cheap, and the window let in just enough light to sketch by. I worked at that stall during the day, then picked up shifts cleaning a bakery at night. My body ran on caffeine and willpower, and when both ran out, I'd bury my face in a bunch of fresh marigolds and pretend I was somewhere else. Sometimes I skipped dinner to save money. Sometimes I watered the flowers while my stomach growled and thought, at least one of us is getting fed. But even in all that exhaustion, there was this quiet spark that never died. Because for the first time, the work I was doing was mine. Not for grades, not for approval, just for me. Eventually, I started bringing my own arrangements to the market on Sundays. I'd wake before sunrise, fingers stiff, eyes heavy, and set up a crate with hand-tied bouquets wrapped in old newspaper. I didn't have fancy labels or social media followers, just emotion. I poured everything into those flowers: grief, pride, hope, defiance. People noticed. A young man once bought a bouquet for his mother and said, "It looks like how she laughs." A woman burst into tears when she saw one of my arrangements and whispered, "This feels like my childhood." That's when I knew I wasn't just selling flowers. I was telling stories. And slowly, the stories began to sell. Word started to spread. Not fast, not loud, but steady, like vines finding their way up a wall. People would come back, not just for the flowers, but to talk. To tell me about a breakup, or a baby, or a mother they missed. I listened. I always listened. Then I'd build something for them. Something that could say what they couldn't. That's when I realized flowers weren't decoration. They were language, emotion, memory. And the more I leaned into that truth, the more people leaned into me. I didn't have much, but I had something they felt. One morning, I noticed a woman watching me from across the street. Gray coat, silver hair, eyes like she already knew the ending. She came back the next day, and the next. Then one afternoon, she walked straight up to my crate, picked up a bouquet I'd wrapped in a scrap of sheet music, and said, "You don't just arrange flowers and you compose them." I didn't know what to say, so I laughed, awkward and surprised. She smiled and added, "Have you ever thought about opening a shop of your own?" My chest tightened. I'd thought about it every single day, but dreaming that big still felt dangerous. Her name was Clara. Former florist, now retired, with a shop lease she wasn't using and no children to pass it on to. It's small, old, Needs love, she said, but so do you. I didn't trust it at first. I'd been burned by expectations before, but Clara never pushed. She handed me the keys one day with no contract, just a whispered, "Show them what blooms in concrete." And just like that, I had 4 walls, a leaky sink, and a chance. I cried that night, right there on the cold floor, tears soaking into tile. Not because I was scared, but because I'd finally been seen. I called it Wild Roots. The name felt right. Messy, untamed, true. I painted the sign myself, brushstrokes shaky from nerves and too much coffee, but bold all the same. The shop was tiny, just one room with chipped walls and a cracked front window, but it was mine. I filled it with every scrap of who I'd become. I lined the shelves with jars and old teacups instead of vases. Each bouquet had a story, no copy-paste arrangements. No forced symmetry, just emotion wrapped in ribbon. People walked in, expecting flowers, and left feeling like they'd been hugged. The first month was brutal. Slow days, cold mornings, a delivery van that broke down more than it ran. But I stayed. I made playlists to match the moods of each bouquet. I handwrote notes for people who didn't know what to say. I learned how to fix a leaking pipe with duct tape and a prayer. I didn't have ads or influencers or glossy campaigns. What I had was something harder to define, something that felt like soul. And little by little, people kept coming back. Not just to buy, but to feel something. Soon, the street started whispering about the girl who made honest flowers. I'd see couples holding my arrangements like promises, strangers passing my storefront just to breathe in the air. Someone even left a note on the door once. "Your flowers reminded me I still have a heart." That one stayed tucked in my apron for weeks. I didn't just want to survive anymore. I wanted to build a place that made others feel seen too. A soft rebellion in bloom. And the day I hung the sign outside, watching it catch the morning light, I whispered to myself, "For the flowers that grow in concrete, and for the girl who finally learned she could too." I never planned for any of it to get big. Honestly, I was just hoping to make rent and maybe, on a good week, buy fresh fruit without doing mental math in the produce aisle. But something shifted. One customer told another, who told 5 more, and suddenly Wild Roots wasn't just a shop, it was a heartbeat. I started getting requests from across town, then from out of town. A wedding planner called and said my work felt like poetry in petals. I laughed, awkward as always, but something inside me stirred, like maybe the world was finally ready to listen. Before I knew it, we had our second location, then a third. I hired staff, mostly women like me, dreamers with calloused hands and stubborn hearts. We built everything from the ground up, still wrapping bouquets in old paper, still telling stories through stems. Each shop had its own soul, but the same pulse. People weren't just buying flowers, they were buying feeling. Grief, love, longing, gratitude, all of it translated through color and texture and silence. Somehow, I'd built a language that didn't need words, and people came to speak it. Magazines started calling, bloggers, stylists, even a documentary crew. I said no to most of it. Fame felt like a thing that belonged to other people. I didn't want the noise. I just wanted to keep creating, keep feeling, keep growing. But you can only stay invisible for so long. Especially when your work starts showing up in celebrity weddings and award shows, tucked in behind million-dollar dresses and glossy smiles. People kept asking, where did she come from? And even though I stayed quiet, my flowers answered for me. Every thorn, every root, every bloom. And somewhere out there, my parents were hearing about it too. They never reached out. Not once. I'd hear from old neighbors sometimes, or distant relatives who stumbled across my name in a headline. "Your father must be proud," they'd say. I'd smile politely, but inside, I felt this sharp, quiet ache. Because pride wasn't what I needed, not anymore. I needed the apology that never came, the conversation we never had, the moment where he'd look at me and say, I was wrong. But it never came, just silence. The same cold, perfect silence I walked away from all those years ago. And still, I bloomed anyway. Then one morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A nurse, calm voice, clipped sentences. My father was in the hospital. Something serious. He was stable, but alone. No visitors, no one listed, just a man in a bed, surrounded by beeping machines and the weight of his own choices. I sat on the floor after that call, holding the phone like it might burn through my hand. I didn't cry. I didn't feel much at all, really. Just this strange emptiness, like someone had drained the color out of everything, even the flowers. I didn't go see him. I couldn't. But I sent something instead. A single bouquet of white lilies. No card, no signature. Just beauty in its purest form, dropped into a space that had once been filled with venom. I imagined the nurse setting it by the window, maybe wondering who had sent it. I pictured him waking to that soft, impossible brightness, unable to ignore it. And I hoped, quietly, fiercely, that he'd know. That every petal was a reminder of what he tried to bury, and how beautifully it had bloomed in spite of him. Because sometimes, the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. After that, I started sending more. Not often, just enough, thoughtfully, quietly. A different bouquet each time, never flashy, always intentional. Tulips when the days got warmer, irises for strength, chamomile for the kind of peace I never had in that house. I didn't sign a single one, but I knew he'd recognize the language. He may have never listened to my words, but flowers he understood. And this time, they spoke with all the weight he once tried to silence in me. People around him started noticing. I heard, through someone who worked at the hospital, that nurses would linger by the arrangements, gently touching the petals, trying to guess who kept sending them. Some patients even asked if they could take a few home. But he didn't say a word about me. Not to them. Not to anyone. I imagined the bitterness sitting thick in his throat, heavier with each delivery. I wondered if he realized by now that cutting me off didn't end anything. It just set something fierce in motion. And still I kept going. Back to work. Back to the rhythm I'd built. Flowers, people, stories. We opened new shops in cities I'd only seen in postcards. Our arrangements were on billboards now. But even in all that noise, I kept one eye on that hospital. One root still curled back toward the wound. Not because I wanted to go back, but because I needed to see how it ended. I needed to know if silence could ever be enough to break a man. I never got that answer. But I kept sending the flowers anyway. It started with sunflowers. Bright, unapologetic, almost too loud for the sterile corners of his hospital room. I imagined the way they must have tilted toward the window, proud and impossible to ignore. Sunflowers were for pride, the kind he'd never offered me, the kind I stopped begging for long ago. After that came roses. Not the soft ones he used to give my mother on anniversaries. These had thorns, intact and deliberate. I made sure of it. Because love without pain is a myth, and he taught me that better than anyone. Then came the peonies. Heavy, fragile, full of things unsaid. Regret in petal form. The nurses started asking questions. I heard one of them had started taking photos, not for gossip, but because the arrangements were different. There was something mournful in them, something you couldn't quite name, but couldn't look away from either. They weren't just beautiful, they were deliberate. Like each flower had been chosen to say what I refused to say out loud. The other patients noticed too. One woman asked if they were from a secret lover. Another guessed a long-lost daughter. He, of course, said nothing. But he didn't throw them away either. He let them stay, day after day, watching them wilt in slow motion, like tiny funerals scattered across the room. I used to cry over his silence. Now I used it as soil. And in that silence, I planted everything he tried to strip from me. Every arrangement became a confession. Not to him, to myself. A reckoning in color and scent. I sent lavender for peace, knowing he'd never find it. I sent snapdragons for strength, the kind I had to grow alone. I sent forget-me-nots with no irony at all, because no matter how hard he tried to erase me, I was the one name he could never say out loud without tasting shame. The nurses would tilt their heads and wonder about the mystery sender, asking him gently, teasingly, "She must love you very much." He'd just grunt, clench his jaw, look away. But one day, a new nurse, younger, sharper, too curious for her own good, smiled and asked him directly, "Who keeps sending you these beautiful flowers?" And with a bitterness so thick it could rot the stems, he answered, "My biggest mistake." That story made its way back to me, of course. Small world, whisper networks. I felt something tighten in my chest when I heard it. Not pain, not joy, just a strange, heavy satisfaction. He knew. He knew exactly what this was. And still, he kept breathing it in. He tried to reach out after that. I guess hearing your own failure spoken aloud can shake even the proudest men. A phone call to one of my shops, an email sent to an old address. Nothing direct, nothing brave, just little flares in the dark, like he was hoping I'd guide him home. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because this wasn't about reconciliation. It never was. This was about reflection. About the echo of his choices finally catching up to him in the quiet room he built for himself. And if flowers were going to fill that space, they were going to speak my truth. I started writing again, not in a journal, not in a letter, but on the little white cards that came with each bouquet. No names, just sentences wrapped in petals. You taught me how to survive rejection. Pain grows roots too. You raised me to be someone you could be proud of, but I became someone you'll never deserve to know. I chose every word like I chose every bloom, with precision, with memory, with the weight of every bruise he never apologized for. And still, I signed nothing, because some messages don't need a sender. They just need to be heard. He must have felt the weight each delivery wasn't just a gesture, it was a mirror, one he couldn't look away from. I imagined him reading those cards, pretending not to care, pretending they didn't pierce the silence he used to keep me in line. But silence is a fragile wall, and I had spent years learning how to slip through the cracks. With every flower, I wasn't asking for forgiveness. I was reclaiming power. Every arrangement was a boundary, a memory, a soft, fragrant revolt. I wondered if he ever told my mother. If he read her the cards, or shoved them in a drawer, or burned them when no one was looking. I wondered if he felt anything close to what I felt the day he locked the door behind me. Probably not. Men like him rarely do. But now the distance wasn't mine to carry. It was his. And every time the nurse placed another bouquet by his bed, it grew a little heavier. Because this wasn't just revenge, it was legacy. And I was done blooming quietly. He died surrounded by beauty. Ironic, really. For a man who once called my flowers a waste of time, he took his last breath in a room blooming with them. Lilies at the window, irises by the door, snapdragons wilting on the side table. The nurses said the room felt peaceful, like a sanctuary. But I knew better. Peace isn't just about quiet. It's about closure. And he never earned his. He passed with petals in every corner, but not a single soul to hold his hand. I hadn't sent a bouquet that day. He didn't get a final mercy. At the funeral, I didn't show up. Not physically, at least. I sent one last arrangement. Dead branches, wilted roses, and in the center, one lone magnolia, white and full and unapologetically alive. It was the kind of bloom that doesn't ask for attention. It demands it. The card was simple. No flourish, no softness. Just the truth. This was all I ever wanted, to be seen. You taught me how to survive rejection. You planted my pain. I turned it into legacy. That was all there was to say. That was all that needed saying. They buried him without much ceremony. A few distant relatives, a priest who'd never met him, and my mother in a coat far too thin for the weather. Someone told me she looked like she was holding more regret than grief. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel joy, just stillness. Like a chapter had finally closed. Not neatly, not kindly, but completely. It wasn't revenge I'd chased. It was recognition. And somewhere in the folds of all that silence and bloom, I had finally found it. But closure isn't always the end. Sometimes it's just the space where something new can begin. My mother reached out not long after. A letter, trembling in every line. She didn't ask for forgiveness, not exactly. But she wanted to meet. Just once. To talk, she wrote. I read the note 5 times before folding it into a drawer I hadn't opened in years. Part of me wanted to scream. Another part, Smaller but louder, just felt tired. She'd stood by him in silence all those years. She handed me my backpack without blinking, and now that he was gone, she wanted to speak like we were still mother and daughter, like I hadn't been erased. But I said yes. We met in a cafe near one of my shops. She looked smaller somehow. Not older exactly, just dimmed, like someone who'd lived too long in the shadow of someone else's choices. She didn't touch her tea. I didn't touch the apology that hovered between us. She told me she'd seen the shops. All of them. Said people in her church talk about me like I'm some sort of miracle. I didn't know what to say to that. I never asked to be admired. I just wanted to be loved without needing to earn it. At one point, she reached for my hand across the table. I didn't pull away, but I didn't hold on either. Her eyes filled with tears. "You always were brave," she said. I didn't believe it then, and I'm not sure I do now. I wasn't brave. I was just desperate. Desperate to breathe, to be, to grow. That doesn't make me a hero. It just makes me human. We sat like that for a while, not reconciled, but not strangers either. And that felt like enough. Or at least, all I had space for. Because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It just means I won't carry the weight for both of us anymore. The day we opened the 100th shop, the cameras came early. Reporters, bloggers, influencers, all dressed in curated charm, asking the same questions with different smiles. "How did you get here? What's your secret?" I answered politely, gratefully. But inside, I was somewhere else. Standing barefoot in my childhood room, sketchbook in hand, jasmine curling through the window, I thought of that girl, the one who left with nothing but her spine and her dream. And I wished I could hold her face in my hands and say, "You were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong people." At the ribbon cutting, there was music and applause, a sea of flowers that didn't come from my hands for once. I stood there, not in armor, not in spite, but in joy. Quiet joy, the kind you grow slowly, over years of drought and bloom. A little girl tugged at my sleeve near the end, maybe 7, maybe 8, with hair in crooked braids and a dandelion clenched in her fist. "I want to be just like you," she said, shy and bold all at once. I knelt down, took the flower and smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in longer than I could remember. Not for the cameras, not for the past, not for him, but for her, for the girl who still chooses to bloom.